Advisory. Some episodes of the 1836 podcast are not intended for all audiences, due to details that might be considered disturbing. Listener and viewer discretion is advised.
Hello, I'm Nathan Rogers.
I'm Joe Batterton.
And this is 1836.
In case you didn't know.
On episode 11 of the 1836 podcast, we talk about one of the most famous lawmen that roamed the Ozarks, Deputy US Marshal Bass Reeves.
So, Nathan, what are we gonna talk about today?
We are going to talk about somebody that I'm really surprised that there's a lot of people that don't know who this person is. And I was actually shocked. I had a few people ask, and I told them, look, who's that? Well, we're going to be talking about Bass Reeves.
Bass Reeves was born in July of 1838 in Crawford County, Arkansas. Bass entered this world as a slave. His name was a nod to his paternal grandfather, Bass Washington. Bass and his family were owned by William Steele Reeves, a prominent Arkansas legislator, farmer, and politician. Around 1846, when Bass was just 8 years old, William Reeves decided to relocate his family and operations to Grayson County, Texas. In this new setting, Bass began his life as a water boy on the plantation until he reached the age when he could become a field hand, working alongside his parents. Bass eventually became the property of George, son of William, and adopted the last name of Reeves, neither of which was unusual among slaves and slave-owning families at the time. George Reeves would go on and serve as Grayson County tax collector by 1848 and county sheriff by 1850 and would play an important role in his life. When the Civil War began, Texas sided with the Confederacy, and George Reeves went off to battle, taking Bass with him to serve as a valet. The cavalry unit which George Reeves commanded often fought in areas of the Indian Territory as Confederate forces attempted to convince the Native American tribes to side with the South. At one point, Bass saw his chance to escape. The precise circumstances of his escape from this situation remain unclear, with differing accounts attributing it to a heated altercation over a card game or his attraction to the notion of freedom in the air. Regardless, Bass decided his days as a slave were over. He escaped, disappearing into the deep expanses in the Indian Territory of what is now Oklahoma. There, he lived among different Native American tribes, learning their languages and cultures and gaining their respect. It was within these Native American communities that Bass not only learned their languages but also honed essential tracking skills and became adept with firearms. His transformation was not only one of survival but also a journey of self-discovery, culminating in his freedom with the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. No longer a slave or fugitive, he emerged from Indian Territory, purchased land near Van Buren, Arkansas, and transitioned into a successful career as a farmer and rancher. He wed Nellie Jenny, and the couple raised 10 children, 5 girls and 5 boys, all while Bass occasionally served as a scout and guide for US Deputy Marshals, conducting business within the Van Buren Federal Court's jurisdiction, which extended into Indian Territory and the Ozarks.
Probably especially in his lifetime, probably one of the most famous lawmen that ever lived. You always get in your mind when you think about the old West lawman. I always think about Rooster Cogburn and True Grit and the U.S. Marshals or the Deputy U.S. Marshals like that. And I kind of think of this grizzly, middle-aged white guy. But Bass Reeves, for our stereotype, he doesn't really meet that because he was a young, brilliant African American man, and he was the way I understand it, maybe not the first, but one of the first black U.S. deputy marshals. They say west of the Mississippi. I would say, period. He was one of the early black lawmen, and fascinating person.
Born in 1838 in Crawford County, Arkansas.
So he was an Arkansas feller.
He was an Arkansan. Crawford County at this time was like the wild frontier, like it was here. And what few settlers were there or just people that were heading west and decided they didn't want to go any further, basically.
So for the folks that don't know, can you kind of explain to them where Crawford County is?
It is down around Fort Smith. I think Alma's in Crawford County, and it's the Oklahoma border, Arkansas-Oklahoma border. About,
so it was a border county.
Yep.
Yeah.
So
he was born a slave.
Born
correct?
a slave. His master, owner, I don't know what you would call him, was William Reeves, who was also an Arkansas legislator. And Bass started out being a water boy on this farm, ranch, whatever it was
Plantation of the farm.
Yeah, until he was old enough to actually work in the fields alongside his family. When he was about 8, they moved to Texas. And he would then become the property of William's son, George Reeves. And Bass got his first name from his grandpa, Bass Washington, and his last name, obviously, from the Reeves family, which I guess that was pretty common back then.
Pretty common, yeah. So once he became property of the son, for lack of a better term, kind of a companion, bodyguard, kind of a running partner. He had a lot more, but he had a whole lot more privileges than he would have had if he'd stayed working in the fields or in a trade on the farm. Correct.
Right. And
so that's where you learn. That's kind of where you learn how to shoot and ride and do some of those things.
That's exactly where he learned to shoot. He wanted to learn to read and write, but George didn't want him learning how to read and write. And we were listening to something yesterday that kind of hit me and made sense. That
I know what you're going to say.
He would rather Bass learn to shoot a gun than become an educated black man. And so he didn't want him to learn how to read and write because knowledge is power. And
that speaks volumes. That concept to me is just crazy. That if you were afraid of him because of his race, so you were more comfortable teaching him how to shoot and giving him access to firearms, which you were to giving him access to the written word, and to be able to. I guess they thought that he couldn't think, as without being able to read, which is absurd. But that's kind of mind blowing in a way.
Yeah, so he was illiterate, and in fact, he was illiterate for his whole life.
As far as we know, As
far as we know, which we'll get into later when he becomes a lawman. But that's where he learned to shoot a gun. He got so good at it that George would enter him into contests and more or less win prizes and money off of Bass's shooting.
I heard that he was so good that at some point they kind of banned him from these competitions.
There's places
because nobody else could win because he was so good.
When they saw his name, they're like, "No, you can't enter." But, anyway, he was a big fella. You said earlier he's like over 6 feet tall, about 200 pounds. He allegedly had huge, strong hands, and we've heard several stories where he used those.
His hands were that big.
They were pretty big, according to the stories. Anyway, he just had like a commanding presence about him. He was,
and they said he had kind of a commanding, booming voice, and liked to laugh, liked to joke a lot, but was pretty serious when it come time to be serious.
Yeah. Then George Reeves joins the Confederate Army. Texas was part of the Confederacy.
Civil War broke out.
Yeah, Civil War. George signs up as a Confederate, and he makes Bass go with him, more or less, to be.
Which wasn't uncommon from the things that I've read and accounts that you see a lot of times. These people who owned slaves, especially companion slaves like him, would bring them with them, and I'm sure that he fought right alongside of him for part of it, not just because he wanted to. It was just he felt like it was his duty, to do that because that's what his owner told him to do.
Yeah.
But somewhere in the war, there's a card game breaks out. Supposedly, it's the story that I heard.
At some point during the war, Bass decides he doesn't want to be a slave anymore, and he's pretty well big enough to handle his own business now. Allegedly, it was over a card game. Him and George got into it, and supposedly Bass knocked him out, whipped him, knocked him out, and he hit the road, because doing that to your master, owner, or whatever they're called, that's pretty much a death sentence. And so Bass ran off into the night and ends up in Indian Territory,
which is modern day Oklahoma, for those of you that don't know. That was wild country back in the day. It was kind of, they called it Indian Territory, outlawed. It was kind of an outlaw state.
It was, because a lot of the American marshals or whatever couldn't enforce the law on certain in Indian territories, because that was Indian land. And so a lot of outlaws, if they were lucky to survive in there, they would go there and hide out.
Well, even I mean, this is a different story, but the Youngers, and I'm sure the Jameses probably too, were known. Well, we talked about Belle Star a few episodes back, and we were talking about that. And those guys would seek refuge down there, and if they're going down there to hide out, it's going to be a pretty good place, because they were pretty high profile at the time, which is later. Well, actually, their time periods actually crossed.
Mm-hmm.
So I believe that, and there again, we'll probably touch on this a little bit later, but Belle Star supposedly knew Bass Reeves, or vice versa. Don't know how well they knew each other, but they were acquainted in some form. Probably because he had to serve warrants on her.
And they both lived around Fort Smith, so
right.
A famous lawman's going to know a famous outlaw, and vice versa.
Right.
But while on the run as a fugitive slave, he lived among the Chickasaw, Creek, Cherokee, Choctaw, and Seminole Native Americans, and just really kind
of absorbed that whole lifestyle.
Yeah, immersed himself into their culture, and he learned their languages, their customs, and learned how to track.
Yeah.
And as if his shooting skills wasn't good enough, he even learned some new tactics from the Indians, which would help him later on in life.
Yeah. So, and there again, it shows how smart this guy was. Couldn't read or write, at least not like he would like to. I know he supposedly could sign his name, and but he was smart enough to learn several of the native languages. So
yeah. So he wasn't a dummy.
That speaks volumes. No, not by any stretch.
After the Emancipation Proclamation, he was now legally a free man. So, as any smart man would do, he moved back to Arkansas, the old natural state, and became a pretty successful farmer.
Where all the good guys are from.
Where all the good guys are from. Became a pretty successful farmer.
After returning to Arkansas, Reeves's destiny took an unforeseen turn. It was in 1875, when Isacc Parker was appointed as a federal judge, that the path to Reeves's legendary career began. Parker, famously known as the hanging judge for the high number of convictions in his court, was determined to bring order to the unruly Indian Territory. To accomplish this formidable task, Parker appointed James F. Fagan as the U.S. Marshal and tasked him with assembling a force of 200 deputy marshals. Fagan had heard of Bass Reeves and his extensive knowledge of the Indian Territory, his ability to communicate in various Native American languages, and his reputation for fearlessness. Reeves was an obvious choice, and he was recruited as a deputy, making him the first black deputy U.S. Marshal to serve west of the Mississippi River. Reeves was assigned to the Western District of Arkansas, a jurisdiction that also encompassed Indian Territory, a vast and challenging area that would test the mettle of any lawman. During his tenure as a deputy marshal, Reeves made a name for himself as a relentless pursuer of justice. His record was nothing short of astonishing. He arrested thousands of felons, with some accounts claiming over 3,000 apprehensions. Reeves's duty saw him engage in numerous perilous encounters, and it is said that he killed 14 outlaws in defense of his own life. One of the most significant aspects of Reeves's law enforcement career was his commitment to uphold the law, regardless of the circumstances. This even extended to his own family, as he once arrested his own son, Benjamin "Benny" Reeves, who stood accused of murdering his wife. Despite the painful situation, Bass insisted on his son's arrest, reflecting his dedication to the cause of justice. Throughout his illustrious career, Reeves dealt with some of the most notorious outlaws of his time, and his fearlessness and resourcefulness were widely celebrated. He encountered Belle Starr, Tom Story, a notorious Seminole outlaw named Greenleaf, and Ned Christie, a well-known Cherokee outlaw during his law enforcement career. While it's challenging to pinpoint the most famous outlaws he dealt with, his apprehension of Bob Dozier in a dramatic gunfight in 1878 stands as one of his significant achievements. Dozier was a notorious outlaw involved in various criminal activities, and Reeves's determination and marksmanship brought him to justice. Reeves's ability to adapt and excel in the rugged terrain of Arkansas, Oklahoma, and the Ozarks made him a force to be reckoned with. He gained recognition not only for his relentless pursuit of outlaws but also for his skill in tracking them down in challenging terrains, and his talent for adopting disguises to apprehend criminals. His impact as a lawman remains a testament to his dedication of justice, in a land where law and order were often scarce.
And somewhere in that time frame, ended up around Fort Smith, Van Buren, and went to work in law enforcement.
Somebody by the name of the hanging Judge Isacc Parker, come to Fort Smith, and he authorized the hiring of like 200 new deputy marshals, and Bass Reeves was one. And
Bass was one of them. Yeah,
was one of them. He had a reputation of being a good tracker and all these other, good shooter and a good this, that, and the other. So his name came up, and they hired him. At first, he was.
I didn't understand this until we were listening to another program or reading it. I can't remember which. But the whole posse man thing, which I know what a person is who is a posse man. He's a member of a posse, but I didn't realize that was kind of like a sidekick, or or kind of like an apprentice. It was kind of like
Batman and Robin.
Yeah, so Robin would have been the posse man to Batman's,
or the Lone Ranger in Tonto, which we'll hit on.
There you go. I don't know how much I buy that stuff. I need to look into that more. But supposedly, someone has suggested that he is inspiration, or maybe part of the inspiration for the Lone Ranger story. So he never was a Texas Ranger, but I can see where some of the things he did may kind of fall in line with that. But at any rate, he, for the first probably 6 or 7 years, there's not a whole lot of stories about him. He was there. We knew he was there. He's on the record books. But the thought was that he was kind of like a posse man. He was kind of just the guy that would go with the marshal. And so I'm sure that's where he learned his chops. That's where he learned how to be a marshal, is by helping out and following these other ones and learning exactly what you're supposed to do. Yeah. And the funny thing is, for somebody who's illiterate, the big job of a U.S. Marshal or a deputy marshal is to serve warrants. And in order to serve a warrant, as well as I do from experience, you have to be able to read that warrant.
You got to make sure you're arresting the right person.
But you're right person. Yeah. So he, from what I understand, if they could read, he would make them read their own warrant.
Yeah, he would,
or arrest them until he could find somebody that could read it.
He would organize the warrants in a certain way and have somebody that knew how to read, and then he'd memorize the order. And so
and I'm sure he was probably memorizing the way the words looked.
Yeah.
So,
but there were times he made the arrestee actually read their own warrant to make sure he's the right person.
That's pretty funny. That's an insult to injury, right?
Yeah. So
beat some guy up and arrest him and put him in cuffs and tie him up. So, here, by the way, can you read your own warrant?
Yeah. Believed to be the first black deputy U.S. Marshal. He was not. He was definitely the most famous one, but he probably was the first west of the Mississippi River. But we did find out he was actually not the first overall. And
he wasn't the only. There were
right.
other black marshals that were operating at the same time he was. He just was one of the most effective. I mean, this guy was, just for lack of better terms, he was a badass.
Yeah.
He just knew how to get the job done, and he would do it in unconventional ways. He would disguise himself, or he would.
Oh yeah, I
he'd
think
do
I
all
mentioned
kinds of
he's possibly one of the first undercover police officers
west of the Mississippi.
He was known to use disguises and infiltrate some of these outlaws and bring a lot of them in. But he was assigned over the Western District of Arkansas, which is where he lived, and supposedly covered 70,000 miles. I don't know if that's a radius or what, but if so, that certainly included us up here, because we're only about 3 counties away from him. Can't find any proof he was here, but I would say it's likely at some point he came through here or came here, because it was the Wild West here for sure during this time.
Well, we had which I don't think we've talked about yet. You wrote a book about it, the Tut Everett Tut King War, Marion County War. That was a big kind of Wild West event that happened right here in our county. Bill Hickok's first shootout was in Springfield, Missouri, which is just north of us. There's all kinds of things that happened, up and down through this area. So, yeah, he was that district was the western half of Arkansas and Indian Territory.
Right.
So, all the way out. I guess it's all the way out to what they call the deadline, right?
Yeah,
where the tracks were.
Yeah,
out there, and then they went beyond that, but that was kind of.
Tell them what the deadline is.
Deadline was the way I understand it. I don't remember how many miles it was out into Oklahoma, but just say halfway out. It was like around Stillwater, wasn't it?
I think
or
so.
Was it farther out than that? But anyway, there was railroad tracks. They ran north-south, ran from like Kansas down into Texas, and anything beyond that west was that the tracks were considered the deadline. You go past that, there's no
the other side of the tracks.
There's no the other side of the tracks. There was no guarantee you were going to come back alive. Hence the deadline.
They would even leave.
You're probably going to end up dead.
They'd even leave signs for people like Bass saying, "Don't come over here. We're going to, we'll kill you.
We'll kill
get you, or whatever." But that's when you think about
early propaganda.
Yeah,
Leave it.
You think about these early famous lawmen. Of course, Wyatt Earp comes to my mind right off the bat, but he's really nothing compared to Bass Reeves, because Wyatt Earp would wait in town for something to happen to come to him. Bass went looking for him.
Yeah.
He went in some pretty gnarly places and supposedly made over 3,000 arrests and killed at least a little over a dozen outlaws in self-defense.
They were saying, like, yearly, he was arresting over 100 people. And being a former police officer, I can't imagine arresting that many people. It's just, he covered a whole lot wider area than what, a county or city deputy.
Yeah.
But still, that's a lot of.
You mentioned the posse man. They would have a posse man. They'd have a cook. They'd have a wagon for prisoners. And a lot of times they'd come back with like 3, maybe 4 prisoners. He would come back with like 17. He'd be gone for a couple months.
I read that he several times he'd come back with 15, 17 prisoners. And so that's guys that are having to. He's going out doing his thing, and the posse man and the cook are staying there with the prisoners. Just kind of keeping an eye on them and keeping that whole thing, keeping it under control. But I was sitting there. I was going to make this point before I forget. When Bass Reeves got to the deadline, and there was all these notes and little signs that people put out there making the threats, it never scared him at all because he couldn't read.
Yeah,
he didn't know what it said.
Yeah, it could have been Welcome Bass for all he knew.
He might have recognized his name, but yeah, that's crazy in itself. That you get to a certain area out there, and they're going to start taunting people from that point on.
Yeah. I guess his choice of weapon was a .44 Winchester rifle. And come across some pretty notorious outlaws. We mentioned a little bit ago Belle Starr. We did an episode, 2-part episode on her. I think it's episode 3 and 4 or 4 and 5 maybe. She turned herself in rather than Bass having to go and arrest her. I don't know if that was a mutual respect thing or what, but He also,
I believe it was probably a fear. It was a fear
yeah.
thing that he was gonna.
He also arrested Tom Story, Greenleaf, Ned Christie, and Bob Dozier. I thought that was Dozier, but I believe it's Dozier. And obviously, you know,
Depends on where you're
faced
from.
significant challenges and dangers going after these folks. Like I said, he killed over a dozen in self-defense, and also killed somebody that he stood trial for and got charged for murder, and ultimately
Supposedly spent a little bit of time in jail waiting for his.
Yeah,
But
I don't think that.
I only heard
think,
that from that one source. I'd never heard that before.
I think he was more or less served a warrant, booked, and given a court date. And,
Yeah, I can't imagine them putting him in that jail in Fort Smith, especially when he's probably put 100 of those guys, or maybe 200 of them, in that jail. So I mean, I agree.
That jail wasn't a paradise either.
No.
It was the basement of Judge Parker's courtroom, and there was very little ventilation, and it, from what I've read, stunk. It stinketh.
I thought it was pretty funny that I heard that one guy was telling the story about it. He was saying that it smelled so bad, and it was in the basement. It was like the story under where his courtroom was, and supposedly they would bring sawdust into the courtroom and sweep it and tamp it into the cracks to try to seal the floors up even more tight, because to keep the smell out of the courtroom, they said it didn't even help that much. So yeah, I'd probably be having court outside if it was me.
Yeah, outdoors court. But the fella he accidentally killed was actually his cook. There's a couple different stories of how that happened. Supposedly, one story is it was over a dog, that the cook did some pretty bad things to a dog, and Bass.
Well, one story was it was the cook's dog, and
the other one was Bass's dog.
The other it was Bass's dog, and the cook did something to Bass's dog. But at any rate, everybody kind of agreed that he had a cartridge jammed, had a .44 rifle, maybe a .45 pistol, and accidentally stuck one of the cartridges in there, and then he was working his action and got cartridge .45 stuck in a .44, and it jammed a little bit, and he's got a knife trying to dig it out, and he's kind of got it at an angle, and somewhere in this episode, I don't know if the hammer fell on it or if his knife hit the primer, but apparently I don't understand it, because I've fished shells out like that, and you would think that the shell would have flew out instead of the lead flying down. So maybe he did it on purpose. Who knows? But anyway, supposedly it misfired and it hit his cook in the neck. He sent for help, trying to get the cook some help, and it was too late, and he ended up bleeding out. And so, he tried to do the right thing and try to get him help, but it didn't work. So
yeah, and
anyway, he got charged. He got charged with murder over it.
Yeah, but that's the court version of it, that the misfire had nothing to do with the dog. And some of the prisoners he was transporting at the time actually testified that that's what happened. And so with that, that says a lot right there, that the prisoners he was bringing in testified on his behalf. And then
he actually freed one of the prisoners to
go get help.
Yeah, so I thought that was kind of interesting.
And the fact that he tried his best to get the guy help, he was found not guilty, and continued being a lawman. Pretty good one at that.
Well, he obviously continued up until his trial, so that said a lot about him too. He kept on doing his job correctly. But yeah, after it was all over with, he just went back to work and kept on doing his thing.
There's a lot of cool stories about him out there. One of my favorite is when he was heading somewhere and come across two burly guys, and they asked, "Are you Bass Reeves?" And he said no. He was kind of disguising himself, and they pretty much kidnapped him and said, "Well, you're going to go with us, and the next person we come across their way, we're gonna keep asking until somebody knows who you are. And if you're Bass Reeves, then we're going to kill you pretty much. And anyway, they got tired of that. I guess they didn't run across anybody, and they're like, well, get off your horse. We're just going to kill you anyway. And they asked if he had any last words, and he said, he gets in his satchel and he's acting scared, and will you?
But he says he has a letter from his daughter, isn't it, or something?
For his wife, a letter to his wife.
From his wife, yeah. And can you read it to me one last time?
Yeah.
And then so they let him get in his saddlebags. Bad mistake.
Yeah. With these huge, strong hands of his, as soon as the guy looked at the letter, that's all he needed was just a split second, and he grabs the dude by the throat, gets his pistol with the other hand. The other guy is scared crapless, and I think he supposedly dropped his gun.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, he ends up arresting both these guys and bringing them back, and he wasn't even out there looking for them.
Bass Reeves' hands were that big. There's several stories of him grabbing people by the throat.
Yeah.
So I mean, this guy had massive hands.
Bass Reeves's illustrious career as a U.S. Deputy Marshal eventually came to a close. After years of fearlessly pursuing outlaws and maintaining law and order in the untamed land of Arkansas and Oklahoma, he retired from his federal peace officer role in 1907. At the age of 68, Reeves transitioned into a new chapter of his life. Following his retirement from the Marshal's service, he took up a position as a city police officer in Muskogee, Oklahoma. This transition from a federal to a municipal law enforcement role demonstrated his commitment to maintaining order and ensuring the safety of his community. Sadly, on January 12, 1910, Bass Reeves passed away. His death was attributed to Bright's disease, also known as nephritis, a condition affecting the kidneys. His final resting place is at the Muskogee Cemetery in Muskogee, Oklahoma. His burial site serves as a reminder of the legacy he left behind and the extraordinary life he led. The legacy of Bass stands as a testament to his courage, resilience, and dedication as a formidable lawman who never flinched in the face of danger while upholding the law in the American West. His fearless pursuit of justice, whether it meant confronting dangerous outlaws or apprehending his own son, solidified his status as one of the most iconic lawmen in American history. In more recent times, his legacy has experienced a resurgence in popular culture. His life and achievements have been featured in various books, documentaries, TV shows and movies, where he is honored as an enduring symbol of justice and heroism. Bass Reeves's remarkable story serves as a beacon of hope and inspiration, particularly within the African American community, as he overcame the adversity of slavery and the challenges of the Wild West to become a Deputy United States Marshal and symbol of triumph over adversity.
January 12th, 1910, he passed away due to Bright's disease. I'm not sure what that is.
He was, how old? He was 77?
I think so. Something before that, though. When his marshal days was over, he actually went to Muskogee, Oklahoma.
I think so, yeah.
And was a part of their police department until he was, up in his 70s. And
this thing that was interesting to me is they really wanted him to work the black communities just because they didn't really want a black officer to work in a white community arresting white people, even though he would arrest white people if he needed to. But I thought that was interesting to me that here he was a deputy U.S. Marshal for all those years, and he went out into Indian territory.
And race was never an issue.
Never an issue. He would arrest anybody that needed to be arrested, treated everybody fairly if they would let him, and then served that long, doing such a good job. And then when he starts to get a little bit older, stepping back, a lot of that stuff had changed out there, and then reverted him back and made him step back into that whole racial role.
Yeah,
that's sad and interesting all at the same time to me.
It's a crazy cycle how it went from slavery to freedom and then back to racial issues. It's crazy. But yeah, from a slave to an icon, man. He broke a lot of barriers, and you mentioned the Lone Ranger earlier. A lot of people think he was the inspiration for the Lone Ranger. I'm not sure why. I mean, I can see some similarities. He had his own posse man eventually, which turned out to be an Indian, and so you had a guy. So
that would be his Tonto.
Yeah,
and he was known to.
And he wore a white horse. He rode a white horse.
I never heard that, but maybe
So,
it was true.
If you
Was
take
its
the
name
guy,
Silver?
I don't know. So you take a man that disguises himself on a white horse with
With an Indian sidekick.
with an Indian sidekick. I can see some similarities, but I don't know how true that is.
Yeah, I can see where they would pull some of the stories maybe as inspiration, but him just standalone is the inspiration for that.
Yeah.
It's the same way with the Hickok Springfield shootout with Dave Tutt. That was that iconic high noon shootout, the only one that was ever recorded. But in movies and in books, it happens over and over again, and it really only took place one time. So, Bass Reeves, there's several times where he would kind of disguise himself as a drifter or as a farmer or whatever, just so he would like tie his horse up miles away and walk into these places just to kind of fool the people that were hiding out, just get closer to them. And you see that I remember in the old Lone Ranger series, he would dress up like a miner or a farmer or an old drifter. So yeah, maybe.
But you mentioned movies and books today. I was surprised, like I said, how many people hadn't heard of him, but they're about to, because the same folks that made Yellowstone is coming up with a new TV series about him, which starts, I believe, next week. And
this weekend or next week.
Yeah. So there's books about him. I haven't read it yet, but it sounds real interesting.
Black Gun, Silver Star.
Black Gun, Silver Star, and it's about his life. And there's actual court documents and records in there, and arrests he made, and it sounds really interesting.
There was a movie or a mini series a couple years ago. I think it was a movie, and it was called Hell on the Border. Is that right?
Yeah, I watched that last night. I found it on Amazon. And
did it cover it? It touched on him, didn't it?
Oh yeah, it's definitely about him, but they took a lot of liberties and
it's a movie.
There's a lot of. It's based on a true story, but there's a lot of fiction in there.
But there was like a Belle Star character in there, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep, and Jesse and Frank James.
Yeah. I just remember there being some sections in there about Bass Reeves. Some of it was kind of, on point, but it's been so long since I've seen it, I didn't remember. This new one coming out, it's called Bass Reeves, right?
Yeah, it's called Lawman Bass Reeves, but it looks really good, and I'm looking forward to watching it.
Who's the guy that wrote Yellowstone?
Was it Taylor Sheridan?
Yeah. So he's the one. I don't know if he wrote this, but I believe he's producing it at least. So it should be of that quality. It should be pretty good.
Do you have an Ozarkism?
A toad strangler or frog?
Toad strangler.
Which means you're mad at frogs and you go out and you choke them to death.
No, like Bass Reeves.
Yeah. You would grab them with your big hand. No, toad strangler. That's what we got the other day when it rains so hard. It's frogs like water, but when it rains too much, it'll just strangle them to death. So it was a toad strangler.
All right, guys. Thank you for joining us again. Check us out on everywhere you find a podcast, and make sure you share us and like us and leave some comments to, get the algorithm or whatever it's called.
Nice comments.
Yeah, be nice to us. But share us, like us, and join us again next week. See you guys later.
Talk about something that's cool. Bye.
Thank you to everyone who has tuned in to this episode of the 1836 podcast. We hope you found it informative and engaging. Please like, share, rate, and review. Leaving a good rating and review on your preferred podcast platform would also help us reach a wider audience. Be sure to tune in next time for another episode, as we continue to explore and uncover the roots and branches of Arkansas and the fascinating history of the Ozarks.